Jesus freak here. I've seen four major approaches to how the law of Moses relates to the new covenant. You'll find one stance, which is practiced by Messianic Jews, sacred namers, and Seventh-day Adventists, which is to say that the new covenant sits on top of the old, and thus the law of Moses is still effective and full. Then you'll find some people that say, and for example, the Wesleys were among them, that said that there's two parts to the law of Moses. The ceremonial law and the moral law. And that the ceremonial law is what was done away with. You'll find my stance, which I'll talk about in a minute, and then you'll find a fourth stance that says, as none of this matters. And these are generally hyper-dispensationalists who basically throw out the gospel and say only the letters of Paul actually mean anything. And sometimes not even all of them. So my stance is that while the law of Moses was rendered void by virtue of a lot of it being restated either explicitly or implicitly in the New Testament, that actually carries over. And there's some subtle nuance difference between that and the idea of separating into the moral law and the ceremonial law. See, the point of the law of Moses was that nobody could follow it. And thus, everyone fails in every regard because, like James said, if you're violating one of the 613 commandments in the Mosaic law, you're violating all 613. That's James 2:10. Now, the point of the law of Moses, as Paul says in Galatians 3, is to point us to Christ. All reality points to a single point in time. And that's the crucifixion. I mean, yeah, we use the incarnation as one person calculated it as our epic. But honestly, our epic should be about 33 years later. Now, I admit there's some subtle differences in perspective here. I'm not saying that the entire law of Moses is completely null and void on its face. Even at the same time, I say that it's no longer in effect. Because a subset of it was duplicated. Some of it was made weaker. For example, there's several passages in the New Testament that abrogate kosher laws. Some of it was made stricter. The law of Moses allowed for divorce. The law of Christ does not. So, I'm not saying that things are necessarily easier. But like I said, everything has nuance. I sometimes explain things in terms of the New Testament. I try not to point to Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy to make my statements. The fact that I'd be pointing to Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy can easily be used to tear them apart. If I point to Paul, if I point to the Gospels, if I point to James, it's harder for skeptics to tear me apart. And of course, if they say, "Oh, but Paul in in 2 Timothy or whatever it was just talking about the Old Testament," and I believe, in a sense that's what he meant when he said all Scripture. Well, Scripture did get redefined. Peter, for example, explicitly endorses Paul's letters as being theopneustos, as being inspired by God. He calls them Scripture. And even Paul cites the Gospel of Luke as Scripture. When he quotes the verses, says the workman is worthy of his wages, he's not quoting the Old Testament. He's quoting the Gospel of Luke, and thus endorsing the Gospel of Luke as Scripture. So when I say I'm antinomian, there's nuance to it. I'm not throwing out everything that's in the law of Moses. In fact, I'm not really throwing out all that much in the whole scheme of things. You're going to point to the Ten Commandments, for example. Six of them are restated explicitly. The first three are encompassed in the Shema, and the Shema is restated. And the Sabbath? Well, you got the whole thing about Hebrews 10 and, not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together. So, you can say the explicit text this chunk of the Bible might not govern me in in theory, but a lot of it still does in practice. So there's nuance in the claim that I don't accept the law of Moses. Because a lot of it's part of the law of Christ, which I do accept. Jesus freak out.